Trump disrespected Ibrahim Traoré, not knowing he was the president. The United Nations Climate Summit buzzed with activity. World leaders, diplomats, and journalists filled the hallways of the Grand Geneva Convention Center, their voices echoing off marble floors. Security personnel with earpieces stood at strategic positions, watching everyone with practiced vigilance. In a private preparation room, Donald Trump adjusted his red tie in the mirror. At 78, his movements were slower than they once were, but his confidence remained unmoved by time. He had just returned to the presidency 3 months ago, and this summit marked his first major international appearance of his new term. The weight of expectation hung in the air around him. His advisors had briefed him extensively. Climate change was a contentious topic, especially with the recent devastating floods in Florida still fresh in Americans' minds. Though he never admitted publicly, Trump felt the pressure. The world had changed since his first term. International alliances had shifted, new powers had emerged, and America's position required more delicate handling than ever before. He straightened his shoulders, pushing away the momentary flicker of doubt. Doubt was for ordinary men, not for him. He was Donald J. Trump, twice elected to the most powerful office in the world. These other leaders needed him more than he needed them. At least that's what he kept telling himself. Perfect timing, he muttered to himself, checking his watch. He had specifically requested this side room to prepare before his speech, away from the cameras, away from other leaders. Trump preferred to make an entrance, not mill about with the crowd beforehand. It was a strategy that had served him well throughout his business career and his political life. Control the moment you meet others, and you control the relationship. A young man in a simple dark blue suit entered the room quietly, carrying a folder and a stack of papers. He moved methodically, arranging the documents on a side table. His face was focused, his movements efficient. There was nothing flashy about him. No entourage, no security detail visible, just a man doing his job with quiet precision. The man carried himself with an unusual gravity. Though not particularly tall, there was something in his posture that suggested experience beyond his apparent age. His hands, strong, with visible calluses, moved with the deliberate care of someone who had built things himself, not merely directed others to build them. His eyes, deep-set and watchful, took in the room without revealing his thoughts. Trump glanced at him in the mirror. In Trump's world, staff were background figures, necessary but ultimately interchangeable parts of the machinery that maintained his comfort and status. This was especially true of maintenance staff, service workers, and particularly those with darker skin tones. It was not malice so much as a lifetime of conditioned perception. People were categorized instantly based on appearance, and treatment followed from that categorization. "The water isn't cold enough," Trump said without turning around. "I need ice-cold water on the podium. And make sure there are at least 3 bottles." The man paused, looked up briefly, then returned to organizing his papers without responding. His expression betrayed nothing, but inwardly, Ibrahim Traoré felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. It was a feeling he knew intimately, the weight of invisibility, of assumptions made based solely on the color of his skin. As the youngest president in Africa, at only 36 years old, he had become accustomed to being underestimated, overlooked, dismissed. Before entering politics, Traoré had been a military officer, rising through ranks where respect was earned through discipline and action, not appearance or wealth. He fought against extremists who threatened his nation, had seen friends die, had made life-and-death decisions that shaped the course of his country. The scars on his hands and the one concealed beneath his collar were testament to these struggles. Yet in rooms like this, among Western leaders, none of that history was visible. They saw only what they expected to see. Trump turned around, irritation crossing his face. "Did you hear me? The water. It needs to be colder, and I need more than 1 bottle up there." His voice carried the casual entitlement of someone who had rarely been denied anything, someone whose words were expected to translate immediately into action. The man finally looked up directly at Trump. His eyes were calm, penetrating. Something in that gaze made Trump pause, a quiet steadiness that seemed out of place. It was the look of a man who had faced gunfire without flinching, who had made decisions that determined whether villages would eat or starve, who had buried comrades and risen the next morning to continue the fight. It was a look Trump had seen before, though rarely, in generals who had seen real combat, in business rivals who had built empires from nothing rather than inherited wealth. "I believe you have mistaken me for someone else," the man said. His English was excellent, but carried a distinct French-African accent. "I'm not staff." The words were delivered without anger, without indignation, simply as a statement of fact, spoken by someone who knew exactly who he was, regardless of how others might perceive him. Trump waved his hand dismissively. "Well, whoever you are, just pass the message along to whoever is in charge of these things. Tell them President Trump needs proper water." The man nodded once, then returned to his papers. He didn't seem offended or intimidated, just patient, like someone used to being underestimated. Trump noticed a pin on the man's lapel, small, unmistakably a national flag, but not one he immediately recognized. Something about the man's calm demeanor made Trump look twice. "Are you with one of the African delegations?" Trump asked, his tone changing slightly. "Yes," the man replied simply. "Which one?" "Burkina Faso." Trump nodded, as if he knew exactly where that was, though his geography of smaller African nations was admittedly imprecise. "I've heard good things. Very good things about Burkina Faso. We have some excellent business relationships there." "Very excellent." The man just nodded again, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. Trump continued, warming to the conversation now that he was talking about international relations, his new domain once again. "Your president should call me directly sometime. We could do great deals together. Amazing deals. I've always said Africa has tremendous potential." "Tremendous. I'm sure he would appreciate that," the man said with the slightest suggestion of a smile. The door opened, and a rushed aide burst in. "Mr. President, 5 minutes until—" The aide stopped abruptly, looked at the other man, and straightened immediately. "President Traoré, I apologize for the intrusion. Your delegation is looking for you." Trump's expression froze for a half-second, then quickly recalibrated. The man he had mistaken for staff, the quiet figure organizing papers in the corner, was Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso. Traoré nodded at the aide. "Thank you. I'll join them momentarily." The aide left, leaving the two presidents alone. Trump recovered quickly, extending his hand with a broad smile. "President Traoré, they didn't tell me you'd be in here. What a surprise. A wonderful surprise." Traoré shook his hand firmly. "It is good to meet you, President Trump. You should have said something." Trump continued. "You know, introduce yourself properly. Sometimes it is valuable to see how people behave when they don't know who you are." Traoré replied, his voice still calm, but carrying an undeniable weight. Trump laughed, a short, uncomfortable sound. "Well, I was just focused on my speech. Big speech coming up. Very important topics." "Indeed," Traoré said. "Climate change affects us all, but Africa perhaps most severely. My country lost 20% of its arable land last year alone." Trump nodded as if he knew this fact already. "We'll figure something out. America always helps its friends. I've always been a friend to Africa. A great friend." Traoré gathered his papers carefully. "I look forward to discussing that friendship further, especially regarding the mining rights your corporations are renegotiating in our country." Trump's smile remained fixed, but his eyes narrowed slightly. This wasn't going how he expected. "In my country," Traoré continued, "we have a saying, 'The eyes that look down will never see the sky.' It means those who dismiss others miss the greatness above them." He tucked his folder under his arm and straightened his simple suit. "I will see you at the round table, President Trump. And regarding your water," Traoré paused at the door, a hint of amusement in his eyes, "I will inform the staff about your preferences myself." The door closed softly behind him, leaving Trump alone with the mirror once again. Later that day, at the Climate Summit's main session, cameras flashed as world leaders gathered around an enormous circular table. Trump entered with his usual confidence, waving to the press. He took his assigned seat between the Canadian Prime Minister and the President of Brazil. Despite his outward bravado, something about the earlier encounter had left him unsettled. A rare sensation for a man who prided himself on always being the most commanding presence in any room. For a fleeting moment before taking his seat, Trump's eyes scanned the room, searching for the man from earlier. He would never admit it, even to himself, but there was a hint of apprehension in that glance, a subtle acknowledgement that he had misjudged something important. Across the table sat Ibrahim Traoré, surrounded by advisors. Though many other leaders wore expensive suits with flashy pins and accessories, Traoré's simple attire somehow made him stand out more. There was an authenticity to his presence that the cameras naturally gravitated toward. The Burkina Faso delegation was smaller than those of wealthier nations, but there was a disciplined formation to how they positioned themselves, a subtle echo of their leader's military background. Unlike many in the room who slouched or fidgeted during the procedural opening remarks, Traoré sat with perfect posture, attentive and focused. Those close enough could see the calluses on his hands as he made occasional notes. Hands that had held both weapons and tools. Hands that belonged to a man who understood that leadership was service, not entitlement. His security detail, though smaller than those protecting Western leaders, maintained a quiet vigilance that spoke of genuine loyalty rather than mere professional obligation. When Traoré rose to speak about climate justice and the disproportionate impact of environmental destruction on developing nations, the room fell silent. His words were measured, his data precise. He didn't raise his voice or use dramatic gestures like some of the other leaders, yet everyone leaned forward to listen. We cannot address climate change without addressing the inequalities that drive it, Traoré said. Nations that have been historically viewed as less significant must be heard. Resources cannot continue to flow in only one direction. Trump watched him with newfound attention. There was something commanding about this leader he had mistaken for staff just hours earlier, a quiet power that didn't need to announce itself with volume or spectacle. When it was Trump's turn to speak, he deviated slightly from his prepared remarks. "We need to listen to all voices at this table," he said, gesturing around the room, including leaders like President Traoré, who represents a region with tremendous challenges and tremendous opportunities. After the session, Trump approached Traoré in the hallway, this time with his full entourage in tow. "President Traoré," Trump said, loud enough for nearby journalists to hear, "I'd like to continue our conversation. Perhaps a bilateral meeting tomorrow." Traoré nodded. "I would welcome that, President Trump." They shook hands for the cameras, and Trump leaned in slightly. "Smart move earlier," he said quietly. "I respect a man who can make a point without making a scene." Traoré's expression remained unchanged. "It wasn't a move, Mr. President, just a reality you happened to witness." The next day, their bilateral meeting lasted twice as long as scheduled. No aides were allowed in the room for the first 30 minutes. When security personnel peered through the small window in the door, they saw an unusual sight. Both presidents leaning over maps of West Africa, deep in conversation, with Trump listening more than speaking, a rarity that his own staff would have found hard to believe. Inside that room, something unexpected had occurred. Trump, who had built his brand on dominance and spectacle, found himself genuinely impressed by Traoré's intimate knowledge of regional security issues and resource management. The African leader spoke of water scarcity not as an abstract policy problem, but as a lived reality, describing villages he had personally visited where women walked 12 kilometers each day for clean water. "My people don't need charity," Traoré had said firmly. "They need fair partnerships. When your corporations extract our gold and pay almost nothing in taxes, when they pollute our water sources and then sell us bottled water, this is not partnership." Trump, who respected bluntness when it was backed by knowledge, found himself nodding. "So what would a fair deal look like? Give me specifics." And Traoré did, with precise figures, market valuations, and reasonable demands that acknowledged both American corporate interests and Burkina Faso sovereignty. It was a masterclass in negotiation from a leader whose country had 1/500th the GDP of the United States. When they emerged, both signed a preliminary agreement for a comprehensive review of American corporate practices in Burkina Faso and a new framework for climate cooperation. Photographers captured an unusual moment, Trump's hand resting briefly on Traoré's shoulder, a gesture of respect that Trump typically reserved for those he considered equals. A month later, when asked about the unexpected policy shift at a press briefing, Trump's response surprised many political analysts. The question came from a veteran Washington reporter who had covered 5 administrations and was known for his skepticism. Mr. President, your administration's new approach to West African partnerships represents a significant departure from your previous positions. Some critics suggest this is merely window dressing. What changed your mind about the importance of these relationships? Trump paused, uncharacteristically thoughtful. For a moment, those in the room saw something rarely witnessed, a flash of genuine self-reflection behind the usually impenetrable facade of confidence. President Traoré is the real deal, Trump said, his voice lacking its usual bombastic quality. Not flashy, not showman, but he knows what he's talking about. Sometimes the real power is in the room, and you don't even know it. That's a lesson for everyone, myself included. The press room fell momentarily silent, surprised by the unusual candor. Several journalists later remarked that it was perhaps the most authentic moment they had witnessed from Trump in either of his administrations. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré never publicly mentioned the water bottle incident. He didn't need to. The new agreement spoke louder than any anecdote could. In private moments, however, he sometimes thought about that interaction, not with bitterness, but with the clear-eyed understanding of a man who had seen how perception shapes reality in international relations. On a warm evening 6 months later, sitting in the modest garden behind the presidential residence, Traoré discussed the summit with his elderly uncle, a former teacher who had encouraged his education from childhood. You know, the uncle said, when you were a boy, you would sometimes come home from school angry because the French teacher would ignore your raised hand, calling on the children of officials instead. Traoré smiled at the memory. And you would tell me to keep raising my hand higher, to make my voice stronger, but never to abandon my dignity. Yes, the old man nodded. And now you sit across from the most powerful men in the world, and they must acknowledge you. Traoré looked out at the mango tree that his predecessors had planted decades earlier. The world still sees Africa through old eyes, uncle. They see our resources, not our humanity. They see our needs, not our capabilities. And yet you changed something in that American president's perception, the old man observed. Perhaps, Traoré replied thoughtfully. Or perhaps he simply recognized something in me that he understands well himself, the determination to be taken seriously. In diplomatic circles, however, the story eventually leaked. How the former business mogul had mistaken the African president for staff, and how that moment had paradoxically opened the door to more equitable negotiations than Burkina Faso had seen in decades. What fascinated embassy staff most was how Traoré had handled the situation, with neither the anger that would have confirmed stereotypes about volatile African leaders, nor the deference that would have reinforced assumptions of inferiority. In Washington, during a private dinner with his closest advisors, Trump referenced the incident while discussing strategy for an upcoming African Union summit. You know who gets my respect? He asked the table unexpectedly. Traoré. That guy stood his ground without making a scene. Didn't go running to the press, crying about disrespect. Didn't make it personal. Just showed me through his actions that I had him wrong. Trump paused, taking a sip of his Diet Coke. That's rare. Most people in politics are all ego, no substance. The irony of this statement coming from Trump was not lost on his advisors, but none dared point it out. Instead, they witnessed something subtle but significant, a crack in the armor of certainty that had defined Trump's worldview for decades. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone. True power doesn't always announce itself with noise and spectacle. Sometimes it waits quietly, arranging papers in the corner, watching to see who recognizes dignity regardless of its packaging. And in that recognition, or its absence, characters are revealed, perceptions are challenged, and occasionally, against all odds, genuine understanding emerges across the chasms of culture, race, and power.